I've never felt smaller in my entire life than I did on the night my mother, Diane Carter, gifted my brother Ryan a house in front of a crowd of 100 wedding guests and handed me a shoebox labeled "Of all things, leftovers." It happened right there at Ryan's wedding under a dreamy canopy of fairy lights strung between white silk-draped beams. It was the kind of scene you'd find in a bridal magazine, laughter, champagne flutes, the scent of roses heavy in the air. And then my mom, in her trademark powder blue suit and pearl necklace, tapped her glass with a manicured nail, the sound slicing through the chatter like a sharp knife. The room hushed almost instantly. I stood off to the side, blending into the shadows, like part of the furniture, nursing a glass of flat punch and pretending it didn't sting that no one seemed to notice me. My husband Jake was beside me, his hand warm at the small of my back, but even his touch couldn't thaw the ice that had settled in my chest. I had orchestrated this entire event, from picking out the overpriced florist, to crafting the menu, to assembling the last-minute welcome baskets for out-of-towners while everyone else slept soundly. And yet tonight, I might as well have been invisible. I was like a ghost in a borrowed dress. Mom raised her glass high, the diamonds on her fingers, catching the soft glow of the lanterns as she launched into her speech. Before we wrap up this beautiful evening, she began, her voice rich and rehearsed. There's a little something special we'd like to give the newlyweds. Ryan's grin stretched wide as if he already knew what was coming. He always did. The golden child, the charmer, the family's darling. With her usual flourish, my mother pulled a glossy red folder from her bottomless designer handbag, a silver bow perfectly placed on the front like something out of a real estate commercial. She handed it to Ryan and Olivia like it was the crown jewels. This, she declared proudly, is the deed to your very first home. 4 bedrooms, a spacious backyard perfect for summer BBQs, and yes, a fully finished basement. Welcome to your future. A collective gasp rippled through the tent, followed by a wave of applause. Olivia dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin, while Ryan wrapped my mother in an embrace so tight I half expected her to topple over in her stilettos. And like the dutiful daughter I'd been trained to be, I clapped along with everyone else, the smile on my face stiff and brittle. 'Cause that's what you do, right? You smile. You pretend it doesn't burn like acid in your throat when your family acts like you don't exist. You pretend that you're not still renting a 1-bedroom apartment with peeling linoleum and a toilet that runs all night while your little brother is being handed keys to a suburban dream. And then the spotlight turned to me. Oh, and as for Emily, my mom added, her tone thick with exaggerated cheer. We didn't forget you, sweetheart. Every head swiveled toward me as she dove back into her bottomless purse, rummaging with an air of mock drama. From its depths, she produced an old shoebox wrapped haphazardly in greasy newspaper with a strip of duct tape slapped across the top. Scrawled across the tape in faded Sharpie were the words, "Leftovers." A few guests let out awkward giggles, unsure if they were supposed to laugh. I took the box, my hands trembling, despite my efforts to hold them steady. My face burned like I'd stepped too close to the heat lamps. I lifted the lid slowly, as if hoping there might be something else inside, something that might redeem the moment. But no. Inside sat a single blackened slice of toast, burnt beyond recognition. No note, no punchline, just a charred, crumbling message that screamed louder than words ever could. Well, guess that fits her, Uncle Tom chimed in from the corner, his laugh booming louder than anyone else's. She always did like the crunchy stuff. More snickers followed their laughter, slicing into me like paper cuts. I glanced at my mother. She smiled. Not kindly, not lovingly, but with a smug satisfaction, like she'd delivered a joke only she understood. Then she turned back to Ryan and Olivia, soaking in their glow, their applause, their love. And there I stood, holding a box of ash and humiliation. Jake's hand slipped into mine, warm and grounding, but I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. Not now, not in front of them, not again. Not like last Christmas when Mom gave me a clearance rack candle while Ryan unwrapped a Rolex. I swallowed the hurricane inside me. I closed the shoebox and hugged it tight to my chest, like it was something fragile instead of something meant to break me. Thank you, I whispered, not even sure if it was meant for her or for me. Jake squeezed my hand harder this time, leaning in to whisper, "Meet me by the car in 5." I nodded, too numb to move, too frozen to react. What happened next blurred together. Someone turned the music back on. The guests returned to their dancing and champagne. My mother laughed, that sharp, dismissive laugh that I hadn't heard aimed at me in years. I drifted out of the tent, the shoebox of shame still clutched to my chest. I found myself beneath an old oak tree, at the edge of the garden, the grass cool beneath my heels, the night air thick with the scent of overbloomed roses and expensive perfume. I looked down at the toast, now cracked in half from where my grip had tightened. Footsteps approached. Jake. He wasn't smiling. His jaw was clenched, eyes dark with something fierce and unreadable. He didn't say a word at first, just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver key. He held it out to me. "This is for you," he said quietly. "Come with me." And that right there was the moment everything started to change. 3 weeks before the wedding, before the house gift, before the shoebox, before everything, I thought I knew about my place in the world, cracked apart like old porcelain. I sat cross-legged on the cold, unforgiving hardwood of my mother's living room, surrounded by an explosion of glittery ribbon and half-filled welcome bags that smelled faintly of lavender and hot glue. My fingertips, raw and blistered from hours of gluing and tying, trembled as I attempted to create yet another perfect little bow, though my efforts were met with the kind of indifference that stings deeper than words. Above me, Diane Carter towered, her stilettos clicking impatiently on the polished floor, her hands fluttering with military precision as she barked instructions. She wielded her authority like a general in a war that only she had signed up for, commanding me to alternate colors, to fold the tissue paper without a wrinkle, to remember that we want this to look elegant, Emily, not like some toddler's art project. "Yes, Mom," I murmured, though she never truly listened to my replies. She was already pivoting, her attention drawn to Ryan. Her golden boy sprawled lazily on the couch, with a beer bottle dangling from his fingers, scrolling mindlessly on his phone, as if the world revolved effortlessly around him, and in her world it always had. Ryan had never lifted a finger. He never needed to. I had spent a lifetime laboring under the illusion that if I was good enough, if I got straight A's, if I scrubbed the house until my hands were raw, if I stayed quiet and never made waves, she might finally see me. But Ryan could crash her car, and she'd sigh dramatically, pat his head, and replace it without skipping a beat. That afternoon, as I held up a half-finished bag with an absent gold ribbon, I heard my voice come out small and resigned. "Do you want me to run to the store? We're out of gold." But she waved me off as if my effort was a burden, her perfectly manicured hand dismissing me like a nuisance. "I'll send Ryan," she said, already preening. "He drives faster." Ryan didn't even bother looking up from his phone. I went anyway, I always did. Because that's how it had always been, me offering, her ignoring, and Ryan collecting the prize. By the time the wedding day arrived, nothing had changed. When I showed up at the venue that morning, the air still thick with dew, she didn't even greet me. Instead, she thrust a clipboard into my hands, pointing at a scribbled list with the urgency of a CEO on the verge of collapse. "We're behind on florals. Take care of it." No good morning, no thank you, just orders. And so I did what I always did everything. I coordinated with the florist, adjusted centerpieces until my arms ached. Triple-checked, the place cards patched, a broken chair, rushed to the nearest craft store to buy more votive candles. And when Olivia's veil tore minutes before the ceremony, I pulled out the emergency sewing kit I carried in my purse like a talisman and stitched it back together without fanfare. No one noticed. They never did. And when Ryan and Olivia walked down the aisle that golden afternoon, their smiles as luminous as the string lights overhead, I clapped along with the rest, my smile as practiced as the folds of the napkins on the reception tables. And yes, part of me was happy for them. Truly. But beneath that happiness was a hollow ache, a quiet, festering question that lived inside me like a ghost. Why am I never enough for her? Jake had asked me that once, months ago, after yet another Thanksgiving, where my mother praised Ryan's store-bought pumpkin pie like it was a culinary masterpiece, while brushing aside my homemade apple tart as though it were an afterthought. "Why do you let her do that to you?" he'd asked softly, as we drove home in the dark, the highway lights smearing across the windshield like tears I refused to shed. "She doesn't mean it," I'd whispered, the words tasting like surrender. "She just loves Ryan more. She always has." Jake hadn't answered, not then. He had only reached over and held my hand, his silence louder than any protest. The truth was, I wasn't bitter. Not really. I loved my brother in my own way. He had never been cruel to me. He was just a product of our mother's blind devotion. He had been given everything: college tuition, a new car, after crashing the old one, a downtown loft decorated by my mother herself while I worked double shifts just to crawl through community college. But that night, Beneath the glowing white drapes and soft romantic music, the weight of a lifetime came crashing down on me. The applause for the house still echoed in my ears when she pressed that shoebox into my hands, leftovers, as if I were a stray dog she barely remembered to feed. I found myself standing alone in the garden afterward, the tent glowing like some unreachable dream behind me, the guests swaying to music and laughter that sounded like a cruel lullaby. Through the windows, they looked like a painting, vibrant and alive, while I stood outside the frame as though I had been erased from the canvas entirely. I stood there clutching the box, the toast inside, cracked now in two jagged pieces, and wondered what unforgivable crime I had committed to be cast aside like this. What invisible rule had I broken? And then Jake appeared quiet and solid as always, the kind of man whose love wasn't loud or showy, but present, enduring, the kind that held you together when you felt like falling apart. He didn't need words. He never did. He simply took my hand and led me toward the car. "Where are we going?" I whispered, my voice brittle as the toast in my lap. "You'll see," he replied, his voice as steady as his grip. We drove in silence, the darkness outside wrapping around us like a blanket, the shoebox sitting in my lap, its presence as heavy as a stone. The streetlights smeared past the windows, and with every mile something deep inside me unraveled, a thread snapping loose from a tapestry I had clung to for far too long. I didn't know it yet, but I was on the road to something far bigger than forgiveness, larger than understanding. I was driving toward the version of myself who no longer needed to beg for a seat at a table where I was only ever served scraps. The shoebox taunted me from my lap, daring me to find some hidden meaning beneath the toast, as if maybe there was a letter, an apology, a sign that this was all some elaborate joke. But there was nothing except the bitter scent of burnt bread and the hollow weight of cardboard. Jake's jaw was tight, the muscle pulsing beneath his cheek in that way I recognized as fury. He hadn't said much since we left the reception, and that silence was more deafening than any argument. I could feel his frustration not just with Diane, but with me for letting her do this to me again and again. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible over the hum of the tires against the asphalt. For what, his voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't soft either. It was something in between, edged with pain. "For making a scene," I breathed. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You didn't make a scene, Emily. She did." I turned my face toward the window, letting the flickering streetlights wash over me like a spotlight on a stage where I had never belonged. I felt myself shrinking, folding inward like I had been this invisible version of me for so long I no longer remembered what it felt like to stand tall. That box in my lap, it had shattered something inside me. I could still hear her voice, smug and dripping with false sweetness. "We didn't forget about you?" As if my entire existence had been scribbled in the margins of her to-do list. As if I had worn the label of responsible for so long that she had convinced herself I didn't need love, attention, or effort. Rick's laugh still echoed cruel and sharp, burrowing under my skin like it always did. His laughter had haunted me since I was a girl, like the time Mom forgot to pick me up from my piano recital, and Rick had joked, maybe she walked home. Wouldn't be the first time she got left behind. That had always been my place in the family, forgotten, overlooked, reduced to a joke. I gripped the box so tightly now that the corners buckled under my fingers. "Do you think she did it on purpose?" I asked, my voice no more than a rasp. Jake exhaled slowly, the sound heavy with things he hadn't said until now. "Emily, she didn't forget. She planned it." I stared at him, caught between the part of me that didn't want to believe that, and the part that always had. "I mean, really think about it," Emily, Jake said, his voice cutting through the silence of the car like a scalpel through fragile skin. His tone was steady, but beneath the calm, there was a thread of something darker, something brimming with frustration, and it wasn't just aimed at my mother, it was aimed at me too. "A house for Ryan, and for you, burnt toast in a box with leftovers scrawled on it in permanent marker." That wasn't some oversight, that was a message. His words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable, like the lingering scent of something spoiled. But why? My voice cracked, barely a whisper, lost somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, as if saying it aloud might somehow change the truth he was forcing me to face. Jake exhaled slowly, the kind of breath people take before saying something heavy. "Because people like her need control. They feed on it. And the easiest way to feel powerful is to make someone else feel small. That's what she's been doing to you your whole life." His words didn't land softly. They hit me like a brick to the chest. Not because they were revelations, but because deep down I'd always known. I'd just been too afraid to give the truth oxygen, too afraid of what it might burn down if I did. The house gift, the toast, they weren't gifts at all. They were declarations. Ryan was the chosen one, the investment, the one she believed in and paraded like a trophy. And me, I was the cautionary tale, the disappointment. I hadn't married into money. I hadn't provided grandbabies to parade at her country club. I hadn't become the kind of woman she could brag about between sips of Chardonnay at her book club. I had simply become me, and that had never been enough for her. The bitter taste of that realization scraped against the walls of my throat. "Do you want to know what the worst part is?" I whispered, my voice small, brittle. I still wanted her to like me tonight. I still hoped she'd pull me aside and say, "I'm proud of you, Emily." Like maybe tonight was going to be the night. Jake's hand, warm and solid, found mine in the dark, his grip firm, anchoring me to the present when everything inside me wanted to drift away. "She doesn't get to decide your worth," he said, his voice low but resolute. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the truth was, the ache of her rejection clung to me like a second skin, one that no amount of love from Jake could peel away completely. We turned off the main road, then the world outside, morphing into a sleepy neighborhood, where tidy houses stood side by side like porcelain dolls, each with its porch light glowing like a soft beacon of belonging. Neat mailboxes lined the curbs like sentries, the kind of place where people waved to neighbors and hosted backyard BBQs. Jake slowed the car, pulling into the driveway of a pale blue house with white shutters and a cherry-red door that looked freshly painted. He parked, got out, and walked around to my side, opening the door for me as if he were ushering me into a new chapter of my life. "Come on," he said, and there was a softness in his voice that almost cracked me open. I stepped out, still clinging to the box like it was the last proof of my family's cruelty. The night air smelled of jasmine and sawdust, mingling with the scent of fresh paint that clung to the house like a promise. Jake walked ahead, pulling the same silver key from earlier from his pocket. He held it out to me. "This is yours," he said, and the words barely made sense. I blinked, confusion knotting my forehead. What do you mean?" He smiled, though it was laced with something tender, almost fragile. "I bought this house, Emily, for you, for us. I've been working on it in secret for months." The world stopped spinning. Time froze. The balance of everything I thought I knew tilted sharply, and for the first time that night, the shoebox in my hands felt weightless, like it had been stripped of all its power. I stood there, stunned, holding the key in one hand and the shoebox in the other, in the middle of a quiet, tree-lined street, where porch lights flickered behind gauzy curtains, and the world felt peaceful in a way I had never experienced in my mother's house. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell silent. "You bought this," I repeated, as if saying it again might help me believe it. Jake nodded, calm, but serious, like this was just another part of the plan he'd been building while I'd been too wrapped up in a family that would never see me. "Yeah, found a fixer-upper a few months ago. I've been working on it every spare moment I had. I wanted it to be a surprise." For what I asked, still dazed. "For you," he said. "For us. For your fresh start." I turned toward the house, noticing details I hadn't seen at first glance. The freshly painted steps, the porch swing, the potted fern that sat by the door like it had been waiting just for me. I glanced down at the key again, my hands trembling. I had spent so long begging for crumbs, I didn't even recognize what it felt like to be handed something whole, something real, something chosen. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of everything I'd never thought I deserved. "I wanted you to see it when you needed it most," Jake said gently, "and tonight. You needed to remember who you really are." The words gutted me. I blinked fast, the tears too close, too eager to spill. "But we can't afford this," I whispered, still clinging to old fears like they were lifeboats. "I've been saving," Jake replied simply. And I picked up a side project that helped. "You've spent your whole life giving to people who don't see you, Emily. I wanted to give something back to you." He reached out then, as if sensing I was still teetering on the edge, and gently took the box from my hands, setting it down on the porch with finality. "You don't have to carry that anymore," he said softly. And the weight of those words hit me harder than anything my mother had ever thrown at me. For years I had been carrying that box, the symbolic leftovers of every ignored birthday, every brushed-aside achievement, every time I stood quietly behind my mother while she paraded Ryan around like royalty. I had let it rot inside me like burnt toast, dry, bitter, impossible to swallow. And now here was Jake, not just loving me, but showing me what real love looked like, solid, safe, chosen. I inhaled shakily and stepped toward the door, the key trembling in my fingers as I slid it into the lock. The door opened smoothly like it had been waiting for me. Inside the living room was bathed in the glow of string lights draped along the windows, their soft warmth turning the space into something tender, something alive. A brand new couch faced a stone fireplace, and on the windowsill sat a bouquet of sunflowers. My favorite, their golden faces turned toward me like little suns. The scent of fresh paint mingled with lavender, and at my feet a welcome mat greeted me with the words, "You are home." My chest clenched, but this time it wasn't grief wrapping its cold fingers around my ribs. It was hope. Something I hadn't felt in years. Jake stepped in behind me. "It's not perfect yet," he said. "Still needs curtains, some more furniture, but it's ours." I turned to him, eyes glassy. "You didn't have to do this." He met my gaze unwavering. "Yes, I did. Because I see you, Emily. All of you. And I refuse to let you believe that what your mother gave you tonight is all you deserve." That was the moment something shifted deep inside me, something tectonic. I didn't just feel loved, I felt seen. And more importantly, for the first time in my life, I understood that I had a choice. I could keep chasing my mother's approval like it was some prize at the bottom of a rigged carnival game. Or I could take this key, open this door, and build a life where I was the one who decided I was enough. "I want to live here," I whispered. Jake smiled wide and warm. "Then it's yours." We stood in the living room hand in hand, letting the weight of that decision settle over us like a blanket. For once, I wasn't the supporting character in someone else's story. I wasn't the fixer, the filler, the forgotten. I was the one standing in the light. That night, I didn't go back to the reception. I didn't text my mom. I didn't call Ryan to explain myself. I owed them nothing, not anymore. I curled up on the new couch with Jake wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like plastic and warehouse dust, and thought about the toast, the box, the cruelty tucked inside it. And then, as I sat in the hollow silence of the house Jake had given me, I looked down at the small gleaming key resting against my trembling palm. It was a strange, almost sacred thing, slender and silver, but carrying a weight far heavier than its metal form suggested. In one hand, I held the key. In the other, still clutched loosely, was the box, the one that whispered, "You don't matter." But now, for the first time in the long, aching history of my life, I chose the key. I chose the door it opened. I chose to start over. The next morning, I awoke on the unfamiliar couch, sunlight spilling through the still bare windows like golden confetti, scattering itself across the scuffed floors, and the painter's tape still clinging stubbornly to the corners. For a dazed moment, I didn't recognize the place, and then it washed over me. I was home. A home that felt more like mine in a single night than the house I'd grown up in ever had. I sat up slowly, stretching sore limbs, and noticed the key still gripped tightly in my hand, its edges pressed into my skin, leaving behind a faint imprint, a small, quiet reminder that the life I once knew had ended, and something new had begun. Jake was already in the kitchen, the small, unfinished space humming with the scent of fresh coffee and toasted bread. He looked over at me, his eyes crinkling in a smile that spoke of easy mornings and a life where love didn't have to be earned like a prize at a rigged carnival. "You hungry?" he asked, his voice low and teasing. "I can make something." I managed a smile. "Burnt toast." He smirked. "Only if you feel like starting the day with a little vengeance." We both laughed, and the sound filled the room like warm honey wrapping itself around the cracks in my heart, filling them until for just a moment I felt whole. But peace, I would soon learn, is a fragile thing, and it wasn't long before the sharp buzz of my phone fractured the quiet. First messages from Ryan, then from Diane. Mom's words blinked at me from the screen, cold and clinical, as if she were the victim, not the architect of the previous night's cruelty. "Where are you? Are you seriously still upset over a joke?" "Don't be dramatic, Emily. You embarrassed me in front of everyone." Then Ryan, softer, more pleading. "Hey, can we talk? Mom's really upset. She didn't mean it like that. You know how she is. Please don't make this a thing." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the weight of their gaslighting wrapping around my throat like invisible hands, and then I turned the phone face down. Not now. Not when the house still smelled of lavender and fresh paint. Not when the world outside that phone felt like mine for the first time. Jake sat beside me, 2 mugs in hand, and placed one on the coffee table before resting his hand gently on my knee. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but this time the nod wasn't hollow or automatic. It came from somewhere deeper. "I'm not going back," I said, the words tasting strange and fierce on my tongue. "I'm not going to pretend like that didn't happen." You don't have to, he replied, his voice carrying the steady certainty I still struggled to find in myself. I need to say something, I added, feeling the conviction build inside me like a storm. Not for them, for me. And so that afternoon we drove back to the house I had left behind, not for revenge, not to scream, not to beg, but to return the box, both the literal and the metaphorical. It was no longer mine to carry. The house looked like a battlefield after the party remnants of the night still littering the backyard, empty wine bottles, scattered like landmines, flower petals clinging to damp patches of grass. My mother stood near the patio with Uncle Tom, both of them smoking, laughing as if they hadn't just shredded their daughter's dignity less than 24 hours earlier. She didn't smile when she saw me approach, but her mouth curled into that familiar smirk of condescension. Well, look who decided to show up, she sneered. Did your feelings finally settle down? Jake stood behind me, silent and immovable, holding a small gift bag. He said nothing. He didn't need to. I walked straight up to her, my steps sure, my voice calm and level as I held out the shoebox. This is yours, I said. She blinked, puzzled. Why are you giving it back? Because I don't want to carry it anymore. Uncle Tom chuckled, the sound sharp and ugly like nails on glass. It was just a joke, kid. I met his gaze steady and unflinching. No, it wasn't. It was cruelty dressed as humor, and I've spent my whole life pretending it was okay. I'm not doing that anymore. My mother rolled her eyes, the same tired act, dismissive and exasperated. Oh, here we go. Always so sensitive. Always blowing things out of proportion. But this time I smiled, not the brittle apologetic smile I'd worn for years, but the kind that comes from finally surfacing after drowning for too long. Maybe, but sensitivity isn't a flaw. It's just never matched how you choose to love people. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jake stepped forward before she could. This is for you, he said, handing her the gift bag. She frowned, confused. What is this? A key, he answered. To Emily's new house. It's paid for. It's hers. That's where she lives now. She stared at him, speechless for once. Jake looked at me, then eyes filled with unspoken questions. Do you want to tell her, or should I? I'll do it, I said, turning back to my mother, my voice steady, clear, finally free. I'm done chasing you, done begging for love from someone who hands me crumbs and calls it a feast. I'm not angry. I'm just done. She said nothing. Maybe because she knew I wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a tantrum, this was closure. Jake and I walked back to the car. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I felt clean, lighter. And as we drove away, I looked at the empty shoebox on the floor of the passenger seat, the toast gone, discarded in their trash can. I left it all behind. The weight, the guilt, the need to explain myself to people who never wanted to understand me. 2 weeks later, I stood barefoot on cool tile in the heart of my new kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, as soft music floated through the house like a lullaby. The curtains were up now, yellow linen with tiny embroidered flowers chosen by me for me. There were still boxes stacked against the walls, and the paint in the guest room peeled slightly in one corner. But I didn't care. This place, in all its imperfect beauty, was mine. Every inch of it. Jake walked in with grocery bags, kissed the top of my head the way he always did. Like love was routine, like showing up for someone didn't have to be an event. I leaned into him, letting the warmth of that small, sacred moment settle into my bones. This I thought was peace. Since the wedding, the only thing I'd heard from my mother were a few half-hearted texts, weak attempts to guilt me into Sunday dinners, vague assertions that she didn't understand what she had done wrong. I didn't respond, not out of spite, but because I no longer felt the need to explain my worth to someone who had made a career of refusing to see it. That was the biggest change of all. My silence wasn't about swallowing pain anymore. It was about conserving my energy, directing it toward the life I was choosing to build, not toward soothing the discomfort of those who had never earned the right to my explanations. In the quiet that followed my return to myself, the only messages that trickled in came from Ryan. His tone surprisingly softer, more human than the polished perfection he usually wore, like a second skin spilled into my inbox. His words fumbled with the clumsiness of a man who realized too late the damage done. He told me he hadn't known about the toast that he had assumed, like always, it was one of Mom's quirky jokes, the kind she loved to orchestrate at my expense. And maybe he hadn't known. Maybe he truly didn't see the cruelty until it was too late. I believed him, or at least I believed he hadn't intended to hurt me, not consciously. But I didn't leap to comfort him, didn't scramble to patch over his guilt like I once would have. This wasn't about making Ryan feel better. This was about me finally standing in a space of my own creation, breathing air that was no longer polluted by the expectations of others. One morning, in the soft hush of early light, I pulled the shoebox out from the back of the coat closet. I hadn't thrown it away. Not because I clung to the bitterness, but because it served as a compass pointing to the place I'd emerged from. Tracing the worn letters leftovers across the duct tape, I found my lips curling into something not quite a smile, but not bitterness either. Something closer to quiet gratitude. That box had been my teacher in the harshest of ways. It had shown me that people will always try to tell you what they think you're worth. But their version of your worth isn't gospel. You don't have to sit at the table they've set for you and pretend the scraps are enough. Love, real abiding solid love, doesn't come from people who see you only when you're polished, convenient, easy to swallow. It comes from the ones who see you in your mess, in your silence, in your ordinary, and say you are enough. I placed the box gently into the drawer, closing it softly. Not to hide it, but because I had outgrown it. A week later, Jake and I hosted our first dinner party in our new home. It wasn't grand, it was intimate. A handful of friends' laughter that filled the house like music, soft lights that made the space feel warmer, lived in. At one point, over glasses of cheap wine and stories that tangled with the glow of the evening, someone asked if I'd always lived here. I paused, letting the question land, feeling the enormity of everything that had brought me to this place settle over me like a blanket. No, I said, simply, my smile soft, but sure, but now I do. And I wasn't going anywhere. When the last dish was washed and the final guest had drifted off into the night, I sat on the front porch, the wood cool against my bare feet, wrapped in the quiet of a house that finally felt like mine. The stars scattered themselves like sequins on an endless canvas, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was standing outside the painting looking in. I sat with the realization that all those years I had spent begging to be chosen by Diane, by Ryan, by people who saw me only as the dutiful, quiet shadow, they were gone. Because now I understood the truth. I didn't need to be chosen. I had already chosen myself. Jake stepped outside, 2 mugs of tea in his hands, his presence grounding me in the kind of silence that didn't press down but wrapped around me gently like a blanket. "You okay?" he asked, his voice threaded with that familiar patience that asked nothing, demanded nothing, only offered space. I nodded, the answer blooming from a place of certainty I hadn't known I possessed. "I'm more than okay." We sat there for a while, listening as the night settled into its soft rhythms. Somewhere a wind chime stirred in the breeze, its song blending with the faint chirping of crickets. And as I sat there, I thought about the girl I had been, the one who opened a box of burnt toast and smiled through the humiliation because she didn't know she was allowed to do anything else. I loved her, I mourned for her, but I wasn't her anymore. Now I was a woman with keys in her hand, with a house that smelled of lavender and sunflowers, with a man who didn't just show up in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady ways that stitched a life together. I wasn't leftovers. I was the main course. And if you, like Emily Carter once did, have ever sat quietly in the background of your own life, waiting to be seen, waiting to be invited to the table, I hope this story finds you when you need it most. You are not alone in that ache, and you deserve more. If this story stirred something inside you, I invite you to share it. Leave a comment or just a single word for someone else still waiting to hear they are enough. And if you'd like more stories like this, raw, honest, and full of heart, I'd love for you to join me here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep walking this journey together.